Well, hello everyone. Thank you to a very special episode of Truth Live. As you know from my post announcement and the title of this video, we are going to be diving deep into this insane encounter that the president of Ukraine just had with Trump in the Oval Office this week. I'm going to give all the context and background and get into my thoughts, and also towards the end respond to a lot of bad arguments that I've been seeing from both the right and the left on this issue. But before I get into that, for anyone that has not already seen it, I want to play a short clip of the video, which I think highlights most of the tension that was in the room and just really a lot of the embarrassing antics on behalf of Donald Trump and JD Vance. So let's watch that really quickly. It's about 2 minutes, and then we're going to get into it.
I'm talking about the kind of diplomacy that's going to end the destruction of your country.
Yes, but if you are not
Mr. President, with respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come to the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media. Right now, you guys are going around and forcing conscripts to the front lines because you have manpower problems. You should be thanking the president for trying to bring an end to this conflict.
Have you ever been to Ukraine that you say what problems we have?
I have been to.
Come once.
I've actually watched and seen the stories, and I know what happens is you bring them on a propaganda tour, Mr. President. Do you disagree that you've had problems bringing people into your military?
We have problems.
And do you think that it's respectful to come to the Oval Office of the United States of America and attack the administration that is trying to prevent the destruction of your country?
A lot of questions. Let's start from the beginning.
Sure.
First of all, during the war, everybody has problems, even you, but you have nice ocean and don't feel now, but you will feel it in the future. God bless.
You don't know that.
God bless.
You don't
God
know
bless.
That.
You will not have a war.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that. Remember this.
I'm not dictating.
You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel. We're going to feel very good.
You will feel influence.
We're going to feel very good and very strong.
You will feel influence.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed yourself to be in a very bad position, and he happens to be right about it.
From the very beginning of the war.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards.
But
right now, you don't. Yeah, you're playing cards. You're playing cards. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country. That's back to you. Far more than a lot of people said they should have.
Have you said thank you once?
A lot of times.
No, in this
even
entire
today.
meeting, you said thank
even
you.
Today.
You went to Pennsylvania and campaigned for the opposition in October. Offer some words of appreciation for the United States of America and the president who's trying to save your country.
So that was the clip. Like I said, most of you guys have probably already seen it, but I just wanted to play it at the beginning of this video so we have context for everything that we're going to talk about today. And of course, what wasn't captured in that video is the broader context of the Ukraine war, which I think is worth repeating for the sake of this video, because, and this is going to get into some of the arguments that I've seen both people on the right and the left make, which I've just seen over and over and over again, which are really bad reasons for, if not outright siding with Trump in this exchange, trying to create moral ambiguity when there really is none. When it really is a conflict in this particular meeting between someone of upstanding moral character and dignity and actual leadership representing his country, and then someone in characters of Trump and Vance who wouldn't even know what those words mean if you paid them for a definition of them, right? So the thing that people really fail to understand whenever talking about the Ukraine war is that you have to separate the political policy issue of whether or to what extent America should be financing and supporting Ukraine's war effort, and separate that issue from the morality of Ukraine's cause of self-defense in and of itself. People mix the issue all the time. And that's where you get a lot of this American first sloganeering from the right and from Trump. You know, we have to put America's interests first. We can't be paying all this money for all these wars all around the world. And that taps into a very real and legitimate anti-war sentiment, not just on the right, but just across the political spectrum, especially in light of, the Iraq war and just the history of disastrous U.S. military interventions around the world. That is a justifiable and understandable concern a lot of people have, not just in Ukraine, but in all the sorts of conflicts America's engaged in around the world. And we also know, based off of our recent history and just American history more broadly, most many of the times, and I'd even say even in Ukraine, many of the times our interventions in these places, despite the language that we use about freedom and democracy and independence and all of that, despite using very high sounding moral rhetoric, our reasons for actually being involved to the extent that we are far less noble than the reasons that we give to the broader public. People have even made comparisons to the support America received from France in our own revolutionary war against Britain, right? It's not that the French monarchy was just so wrapped up in the idealism of the American Revolution. They were fighting a Cold War against England. They wouldn't have called it that back then, but that's what the terminology we would use now. They were fighting a Cold War against England and using America as a proxy war to adjudicate that conflict. So yes, they were funneling and bankrupting themselves as one of the causes that led to the revolution, bankrupting themselves in this global geopolitical arms race against the UK, using America as its puppet. But we were very happy to be that puppet because that was the way that we knew we were going to get the arms for our own resistance. So the point that I'm making is that you can have legitimate discomfort or concerns about the principle of America spending hundreds of billions of dollars for the defense of a country on the other side of the world, while recognizing that in the moral realm, this is one of those very rare conflicts in world history where it's a pretty sharp line between the good guys and the bad guys. Whatever criticisms people want to level at Ukraine, no one can argue that they deserve to get invaded by Russia, which is what makes the conduct, particularly for me, it makes the conduct that Trump and Vance demonstrated in that meeting so morally reprehensible. It's like, you can put aside the policy disagreements of, okay, we think that we can talk about how we want to support, or if we want to support Ukraine financially and militarily. But the outright hostility and frankly hatred it seems that Trump has for Zelensky, and then you contrast that to the warm feelings and the praise and the admiration he clearly has for Putin, it's like a complete moral inversion for this man when it comes to the conflict. And there's one more very short clip, it's a few seconds here, that I want to play that some of you may or may not have seen when Zelensky arrived at the White House. Before they even sat down for this interview in the Oval Office, just look at the first words that Trump had for the Ukrainian president, mocking him basically on his appearance. We're going to look at that. It's about 15 seconds.
Pretty close. How are you? Pretty sure.
He's all dressed up today.
President Trump, what's your message to Vladimir Putin, sir? President Trump, you got enough. President Trump, you got enough.
So that's basically the clip, right? The first things that he had to say to what's supposed to be an American strategic ally is literally mocking the man for his appearance. That tells you everything you need to know about the tone and the tenor of that meeting and the conversation that they were going to have that day. Where it's weird. It seems like there's this literal irrational hostility that Trump, for seemingly no reason, displays towards Zelensky. And for my Christian followers who I know are watching, like as I was watching the meeting and thinking about the praise and admiration Trump has for Putin versus Zelensky, I couldn't help but think about the quote from Isaiah 5, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, right? It's this one right here. It's like, woe to those that call evil good and good evil. Because it feels like, and you can describe that for a lot of the Trump and MAGA phenomenon, the total moral inversion that they participate in endlessly on a variety of issues. But in this issue in particular, particularly in how it was related to the humiliation that Trump went out of his way to inflict on Zelensky in this meeting, it really drove that point home for me. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what it is exactly Trump likes about Putin and what exactly he doesn't like so much in Zelensky. Even going back to the Russiagate conspiracy that became really popular after Trump won in 2016, there's been this insistent accusation from many people on the left that, oh, well, it must be some really corrupt business deal Trump must be engaged in with Putin, or it has to be some leverage that Putin has over Trump. And I really think that the explanation is a lot more simple and frankly a lot more disturbing. than just something as easy as a quid pro quo or bad optics for some shady thing Trump did behind the public's back with Putin. And the truth is that Trump sees himself in Vladimir Putin. This is what people have talked about in his admiration and praise of dictators. It's birds of a feather, flocking together. It's the same reason why he likes Kim Jong-un. It's the same reason why he's praised Xi, Erdogan, Netanyahu, every bully and bad guy and gangster around the world. Trump has admiration for, because that is what he himself is. From the very core of his being, it emanates from him. So when he sees people like Putin, I mean, where was that quote? I think I have it somewhere here, just to show how crazy it is. But it's where I'm not sure if I can find it. But anyway, it's when Trump praised Putin, calling his invasion of Ukraine smart. He said he was smart for invading another country. It's like Trump admires all the bad things dictators around the world do, because that is what he himself wants to do. He deeply identifies with their bullying, with their violence. And the reason why he doesn't like Zelensky, one of the reasons why he doesn't like Zelensky, is that Zelensky represents a principled stance against authoritarianism, against dictatorship, and against Trump's personal dictator buddy, Putin. Zelensky embodies everything that Trump, he embodies all the virtues that Trump doesn't have, which really bothers him, right? The decency, the dignity, the selflessness. And of course, because Trump is a narcissist, he also does not like the way in which Zelensky has been made into a hero of sorts, a pop culture icon, particularly in the advanced democracies in the West. He doesn't like the attention he's received. He doesn't like the adulation he gets. I'm sure he doesn't like the fact that after that White House meeting, when Zelensky tweeted, just support for Ukraine and reiterating his positions, he got almost 1 million likes on X. Trump doesn't like to share the spotlight, and he doesn't like any world leader being praised or adored in ways that he would like for himself. So the beef that he has with Zelensky and the praise that he has for Putin, it's on a deep spiritual and psychological level for Trump. He's gravitating towards the things he feels to be most in line with his own character, as twisted and perverse as it is. And he has a revulsion to all of the things in Zelensky's character that shine a mirror and cast a light on to just how distorted and warped Trump's character and worldviews are. And, their beef goes back even to Trump's first term, right? Y'all remember this one. Trump's entire first impeachment was about Zelensky refusing to give Trump the dirt he wanted on Hunter Biden so that he could use in the campaign. He asked, Zelensky refused, he didn't want to get into it. And ever since then, and you know how Trump personally feels about anyone defying him or going against his wishes or not feeling like they are personally beholden to him. And I also see comments coming in. I should have said this at the beginning. I will address comments at the end, and please make sure as you are commenting, if it's on a specific topic that I mentioned or something in the video, please just make it clear what your comment is about, so that when I go look at it at the end of the video, I'll have the context to be able to respond to it clearly. But anyway, so yeah, Trump doesn't like Zelensky. Zelensky pushed back against him pretty hard in his first term because he doesn't just bow down and roll over, which is what Trump expects from everybody. And that also gets to the heart of J.D. Vance's complaint that he didn't thank America. He's like, oh, have you thanked the country once in this entire meeting? And of course, that was incredibly dishonest framing, as has now been reported widely. Like, Zelensky has thanked America ad nauseum repeatedly for their support in the Ukraine war. But of course, what Vance meant by that is, oh no, you need to thank Donald Trump personally. You have to bow down and kneel and beg and grovel before our God Emperor King Trump and personally thank him for your deliverance. And God, there's so much wrong with this. But the thing that really just gets me is how, the extent of the gaslighting and how morally perverse that framing of the situation is. It's like, wait a second. Let me get this straight. I should be thanking Donald Trump, the man who campaigned He and his political party have turned the self-defense of my country into a partisan political issue and have threatened time and time again to defund our war effort and sell us out to Vladimir Putin, which is what was the broader context of what was going on in that meeting. He's like, I should be thankful to that man for what exactly? Am I supposed to do the whole song and dance where regardless, which is what basically everyone around Trump did. It's Marco Rubio was in that meeting, JD Vance was in that meeting. People who had previously opposed Trump had said very strong things and negative things against them. But once they decided to bow down and kiss the ring, they were elevated to all these positions of power. Zelensky wasn't willing to sell out his or his country's dignity as cheaply as Vance and Rubio were willing to sell theirs. So it's like, listen, I'm willing to talk to you. I'm willing to engage with you. If we have policy differences that we can resolve, we can talk about it. But no, I don't feel personally compelled to grovel and beg before this person that has made it clear that he despises me, not because of anything I've done, but because I represent moral values that he can't stand, and because he's best friends with the murderous dictator invading my country. And then on top of that, to make Vance's suggestion even more extreme and more absurd and more perverse, is the broader context of, I'm sure you guys heard about the mineral deal, between that Trump wanted to work out with Ukraine, originally up to $500 billion. Trump wanted to basically extract Ukraine's mineral wealth as a form of back payment for the arms transfers and the military and financial assistance America has given Ukraine over the course of this war. So just to be entirely clear about what was happening, Trump wanted to use this country's moment of greatest crisis and most dire need as an opportunity to enrich America, already the wealthiest society in the history of the world. He was doing this to a supposed ally, a country that when we were attacked on 9/11 and invoked Article 5 of the NATO agreement, the NATO treaty, the only time it's ever been invoked in history, which calls for the mutual defense of all members, they rallied to our support and probably followed a lot of misguided foreign policy decisions that we made as a result of that attack. And they followed us into the breach, and they didn't ask for back payment. They didn't ask for concessions. They didn't ask for extractive deals from the United States. I mean, just the utter shamelessness and moral depravity of choosing to exploit, well, really any country in these particular circumstances would be reprehensible, but particularly an ally, and also one that is so clearly in the right morally in this issue. This is why I said you have to separate, because I know people are going to want to tussle with me after saying that. They're like, well, who says that Ukraine's entitled to get all of our stuff for free? This is why Trump was talking about America first, yada, 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 yada. Listen, if you don't want to support Ukraine, you don't have to support Ukraine. Like, no one's telling you that you have to fork over $100 billion or whatever it is. If you really are that morally opposed to this war effort, then don't support it. But don't then turn around and say, okay, I'll support you with these conditions attached, and use your greatest tragedy, use your greatest crisis as a moment to enrich ourselves. That is morally reprehensible. Either stay out of it because you really want to put America first, or support them, but don't try and turn it into an opportunity for you to cash in, because that is reprehensible. But of course, things like that, morals, a sense of decency or fairness, don't matter to Trump or the people around him. Bret Stephens, who I almost never agree with on anything, really hit the nail on the head with his analysis of the situation. When he made the comparison, he's like, wait, imagine if Roosevelt had tried to pressure Churchill into extractive concessions in exchange for America's support of Great Britain when it was fighting Hitler. And mind you, this extraction is coming with no material guarantees. Right? No material guarantees. It's not like, okay, if we give this to you, then you promise indefinite support of our effort, or you're going to make sure that Putin abides by his terms of the ceasefire. It's like, no, just give us over the mineral deposits, and we'll take it from there. And this is the person that Zelensky is supposed to be grateful towards and bend over backwards and grovel before and kneel before. That this is the person who he owes gratitude towards. someone who goes out of his way to humiliate him, disrespect him, take his enemy's side in the worst tragedy in the country's history since Stalinism, and then to pretend for Vance and the people that support him to pretend like they don't know what they're doing, the intellectual dishonesty, that they don't know how absurd and incoherent their moral and intellectual framing of the argument is. It's obscene, right? Kamala was saying, even in her debate with Trump, that, listen, if Trump were president right now, Putin would be sitting in Kyiv as we speak, because it was that clear from the start what Trump's intention was with Ukraine. And for Ukraine to have to enter Trump's world of unreality and go along with his lies, that he is actually some kind of honest broker in this conflict, when he is clearly compromised, whether because of some actual conflict of interest with Russia, I don't know, that hasn't been substantiated, but certainly it is a moral compromise that he cannot discern good and evil in this situation because he can't do it in his own life. He has no respect for any norms of morality or decency himself. So of course he can't show it in this particular context. And while we're on the topic of America first, I'm so glad we got to this point in this discussion, because one of the most annoying framings that I've heard, not just about this mineral deal, but overall, to justify the Republicans justifying why they despise Ukraine so much, and basically just making Zelensky some kind of villain, like he was a moocher or a freeloader on the United States, and be like, oh, you know what, this is why we need to put America first. People have been ripping off America for too long, not just Ukraine, but the rest of Europe. The problem with saying America first is that it implies that America is now, or has ever been in its history, a country that did not always put itself first. The history of America in foreign policy and even domestically is consistently putting itself first, no matter who has to pay the price, no matter who gets hurt, harmed, or rolled over, being willing to topple entire governments, destroy entire civilizations, break entire peoples. There's almost nothing America has not been willing to do if it thought that either it would benefit, or more importantly, its narrow band of oligarchs who sit at the top of society and really control the country would benefit. It has never shied away from any kind of brutalization or exploitation or extraction if it thought it was going to benefit, right? Even the valorization we like to do of our history with our involvement in World War II and feeling like, we're the good guys and we were fighting the bad guys. And that framing is largely true just because of how morally depraved the Nazi regime was. But the broader issue with that framing is that y'all knew who Hitler was and what he was doing for years, and only decided to intervene after, not just after you were attacked at Pearl Harbor, but then 2 days later when Hitler decided to declare war on the United States. What does that mean? Your opposition to Nazism was never a principled opposition to Nazism as an ideology, as a racist, imperialist, and genocidal ideology. You only cared to fight against it when it started being against your own interest. And all of the global institutions that we have created in the aftermath of World War II, all the diplomatic relations that we have with countries, whether that's giving them military aid or financial aid, America is not doing that out of the kindness of its heart. It is always part of a broader 4D chess political maneuver where America is trying to accumulate soft power with a bunch of countries with all of these strings attached for the things that it does and for the goodies that it gives out to these countries around the world, so that it can ask for favors and concessions later on things that matter to America more than whatever little goodie they parted with in order to partner with that nation. That's our whole theory behind foreign aid, which is why it was hilarious when they were shutting down USAID, saying that, we're just giving all these handouts to these countries. It's like, no, we're consistently giving them a carrot that we can dangle over them and use them to get them to do stuff that we want, right? Even when we take the Ukrainian example, it's like, why did America spend $350 billion to fight this war for Ukraine? Because we weren't doing it for Ukraine. America saw an opportunity to ruin financially, militarily, and economically one of its greatest geopolitical rivals in the world, Russia. It's not a secret that for decades now, America has badly wanted regime change in Russia. Obviously, they couldn't directly go to war with Putin themselves because that would risk World War III. So the hopes would be that they could find some opportunity, some mistake Putin would make that they could exploit to put maximal pressure on his regime and get it to collapse from the inside, the same way we got the Soviet Union to collapse from the inside. That's how we won the last Cold War we were engaged in. So when Putin made the decision to invade Ukraine, most of the U.S. military establishment was praying to God that or thanking God that their prayers were answered, because now they just found a way to accomplish a primary objective of their broader geostrategy overnight. They could basically get Ukrainians, instead of sending American troops, to die on battlefields or having to draft any American citizens and dealing with complaints from constituents, America could just continue to send money and weapons and bombs overseas, let the Ukrainians do all the dirty work, let them do all the dying, and we could just sit back and wait for the inevitable collapse of Putin's Russia. That's not a conspiracy theory. That is literally how we fought the entire Cold War, which is why it's almost a little bit of a misnomer to even call it cold, because it was only cold in the sense that Americans and Russian troops did not directly fight and die killing each other. But it was very hot in the sense that millions of people around the world, particularly in the developing third world, were all paying the price directly for American and Soviet imperialism. I mean, we have a figure here that's in the highlighted part. Somewhere around 20 million people around the world died in the proxy wars the US and the Soviet Union were fighting around the world for influence. I mean, just for context, if that were a standalone war, that would be the second deadliest conflict in world history after World War II. So this is what America routinely does, using proxies to advance its interests so that it doesn't have to send its own men, women, children, sons, and daughters to die on battlefields. So the deeper argument that Zelensky could have made, even in addition to Trump being a narcissist who does not have Ukraine's best interests at heart, is that don't act like America was giving this money because it was primarily concerned about the selfless defense of Ukraine. You cannot explain most of America's foreign policy commitments and decisions based off of a principled commitment to human rights, democracy, and equality. Just look at all of the authoritarian regimes we have supported in our history and continue to support today. Obviously, American assistance has nothing to do with democracy or morality, and everything to do with shrewd self-interest of how do we maintain the global power structure of American hegemony. Now, just because that is true, that doesn't mean that the specific conflicts in and of themselves, like again, separating the politics of America's involvement, that doesn't mean that the people fighting in these conflicts don't have justifiable and even admirable moral causes. It just so happens that their admirable moral cause happens to align with the preferences of American foreign policy. And the second that they don't, well, America also has a long history of stabbing its partners in the back and hanging them out to dry when the going gets tough, which is precisely what we're doing with Zelensky and Ukraine right now. And then another bad argument that I've heard is how, or explaining why America shouldn't be supporting this war, is that, well, it's a losing conflict, right? This is I think there might be a specific tweet that I had. I'm not sure if I have it over here. It's really not that important, the tweet itself. It's just the idea that people are like, well, there's no way Ukraine can win this war, so why are we, quote unquote, wasting money helping them, right? It's like, well, they're going to lose anyway, so just let them lose. There's no reason for us to spend hundreds of billions of dollars helping them lose. And first of all, there's a pragmatic response to this question. Before I even get into the moral arguments here, right? This totally, because let's think this through, right? What is the logic for thinking that it's an unwinnable war for Ukraine? What, that Russia is bigger, has more money, has more people, is more militarily sophisticated than Ukraine, even with all the assistance that America has given Ukraine? Are we not the same people who watched a ragtag band of militias in the hills of Afghanistan thwart the most powerful military in the history of the world for 20 years? Again, not saying we should get into an endless quagmire of giving Ukraine hundreds of billions of dollars for however long it takes to fight Russia. It's just on the pragmatic point. Stop acting like just because a military force is smaller or less well-financed or less well-organized, they cannot defeat a much larger imperial power invading their country. The Afghans did it twice, both against the Russians and against the Americans. Obviously, we know our history of Vietnam, and we went in so confident that with our nuclear weapons and our strategic bombers, of course we can defeat this ragtag band of guerrillas who are living in jungles with AK-47s and bamboo booby traps, right? Particularly when the stronger power is an invading force. The entire logic behind these conflicts, whether you have a foreign sponsor or not, is like, listen, at the end of the day, this is our country and we're not going anywhere. We were here long before you got here, and we can wait you out much longer than you have patience for. Whether it's next year, 10 years, or 20 years from now, we are going to keep fighting. And eventually you are either going to go broke, lose interest, or have your population turn so sourly and bitterly against this war that it will not be worth it for you. It is a war of attrition by definition. They are counting on breaking the will of the invading force, and it's worked many times throughout history. The entire history of the wars of decolonization around the world. You look at the Algerian independence movement. We already talked about Vietnam. You look at the failed insurgency the British tried in Malaysia. So just on a practical level, that argument just ignores not even ancient history, very recent history, and just the history of modern warfare and guerrilla tactics more generally, right? But on now going to the moral question, I mean, and this goes back to America's rhetoric, right, about World War II, and we bravely fought the Nazis who wanted to invade and conquer the entire world. I know it's not America, the country that will never stop talking about its brave resistance to Nazism and how and praises Winston Churchill and how he understood never to appease aggressors. It's not people in that same country who are saying a country that fought a war to gain its own independence from a colonial imperial power. I know it's not that same country that is now talking about, well, a war to fight for your own independence against a foreign imperial invading force really just isn't worth it, and you should just kind of throw in the towel and give up. It's like we are intentionally trying to unlearn the lessons from World War II. Frankly, we're doing that in a lot of different contexts, and bringing fascism back and normalizing hate speech, and totally destroying the international rules-based and humanitarian laws around the world that we created in the aftermath of World War II and the violations of human rights. But particularly in this context, one of the central lessons of World War II is that you do not stop aggressors by rolling over and appeasing them and giving them what they want. That only emboldens them. If you want to stop an aggressor, you can't go and sign peace treaties with them. They don't care. They'll lie to you 1 second, they'll sign the paper, and then they'll turn around and go kill your people or invade your country. This is what Zelensky pointed out in the meeting with Trump, where he was arguing with Vance. Vance is like, oh, you guys aren't partners for peace. Y'all don't want to engage in diplomacy with Russia. And then Zelensky just pointed out, he's like, literally every ceasefire we have signed with Putin, he has violated. Why should we have any confidence that if we make him sign another piece of paper, that will make us any more safe from Russian aggression than it did every other time we signed a piece of paper? Again, it's in being intentionally ignorant of history and the broader morality around this conflict, just to push a really wrong-headed partisan point. And then another terrible, mostly right-wing argument. And this also relates to the America First how Europe should pay for its own defense. And like, okay, like maybe we can agree that Ukraine's cause is worthy or just enough that we want to contribute some resources to supporting them financially and militarily. But Europe is not paying its fair share. They're taking advantage of us too. They're being free riders. Well, what about them, right? As NATO members, they're not paying their 2%. Of course, when the NATO countries told Trump they would start paying their 2%, Trump then shifted the goalpost to make it 5%, knowing that obviously they would reject because he obviously doesn't actually care about getting NATO to be involved with America in collective security. He is against the idea and concept of NATO itself because it's against the interests of his friend, Vladimir Putin. But I want to get to a more central point. About why America's interests are not served by having a European continent that is involved in its own self-defense. And once again, it's one of the lessons of World War II that is being currently unlearned in real time by a significant portion of this population. And the lesson is that when Europe starts arming itself, bad things happen. That was the whole lesson of World War II. For centuries, Europe had fought wars amongst themselves, nation against nation. It wasn't as much of a problem. I mean, obviously it was terrible and created like mass death and suffering, but it became intolerable once you got highly mechanized, advanced modern warfare, where now you were killing people by the tens of millions. And then once you add to that the creation of nuclear weapons, you don't want a bunch of half a dozen states with long histories of bloodshed and national hatred against each other to now have weapons of mass destruction all right on each other's borders. That was a nightmare scenario for American national defense and security. So we're like, we probably want to move away from that system. We're like, Europe, you just focus on building your nursing homes and your pension plans and healthcare for your citizens. We're not going to give it to our own citizens because we're going to be busy creating this mass military support for global security. But we think that in doing so, we're actually going to create a safer, more stable world. So once again, it was not out of any sort of goodwill or compassion that America agreed to this security arrangement that we currently have with Europe, where we are the ones primarily in charge of their defense. We did it because we did not want a World War III on our hands. Because like I said, when Europe arms or when Europe gets involved in aggressive foreign policy, bad things happen. The climax of this point, and we can move through this one speedily because I don't want to make it a video about this, but it was the Suez Canal crisis in 1957. Where behind America's back, France, Britain, and Israel all had a plan to invade Egypt and take over the Suez Canal because of their policy disagreements with the Nasser government of the time. America found out, ordered the countries to get out. Eisenhower, who was president at the time, was furious, and he basically said, don't y'all ever try this again. And that was basically the end of Europe getting involved in directly and independently in sensitive global affairs. Because when they try to do stuff on their own, they make an entire global crisis that America then has to deal with. And we were tired of doing that. But like, from now on, we're going to be handling these broader global conflicts. So it has nothing to do with us being taken advantage of. We created these systems and these arrangements because we believe and still believe that they largely serve our self-interest. And now that we are trying to step away, the thing that American foreign policy strategists were trying to prevent for decades is now coming to fruition, where now the newest news is that Europe is now starting to seriously consider rearming itself with nuclear weapons, because that's exactly what the world needs, a broader and greater chance of nuclear war. But I wouldn't be fully honest if I just took the right to task for some of the bad arguments that I have heard about Ukraine. I've also heard similar arguments being made on not the same arguments that I was talking about, but similarly bad, poorly reasoned arguments being made on the left for either why we shouldn't care as much about Ukraine as a lot of people do, or Ukraine isn't really as good as they want to make you seem. And I'll try and be charitable before I come off sounding harsh. I understand that a lot of these sentiments are driven by, in the abstract, like good motives, and that like, okay, we want to care about suffering people all around the world and not just focus on this one conflict that just happens to involve this white European nation. And it seems like these people's lives are always more valuable than people dying on other sides of the world. Or we have genuine questions about US militarism and imperialism, and is NATO and fighting Russia and doing all these grand imperialist war games around the world, is that really in the best interest of most American citizens? People who, like I said, are struggling with their rent, with being financially insecure, who don't have healthcare, who don't have a social safety net, and we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars around the world, playing these war games. So I just want to say at the outset, I understand all of those sentiments, but I think taking to the degree that I've seen some of them online, I think that they are fundamentally misguided. So I'll show some of them here now. And I'm not calling out the people that I call out, if I can even find them. Here it is. I'm not calling out those people specifically. I'm just using them as representatives, as like broader ideologies and arguments that I'm seeing play out. So let's go to the first one. And I'll call this argument, but what about Gaza? So basically, I won't force you to read this entire thing, but I wanted to keep it up for context. The author basically is attacking anyone who supports Ukraine or Zelensky, particularly in the context of this meeting with Trump, as like a sheep. It's like, oh, you're just brainwashed. You watch corporate media. That's why you care about Ukraine, but you have nothing to say. You have nothing to say about all these other terrible humanitarian conflicts going on in the rest of the world, particularly Gaza, and it lists other things. So first of all, I really hope someday we can get to the point where people realize that empathy is not zero sum. You can care about something going on in one part of the world very passionately and care equally about some other terrible thing going on affecting some group in some other part of the world. It's not as if just because we, at least as a principle of morality, we can have policy disagreements about what should we do, what should the United States financially and militarily do to support Ukraine, but we can agree in principle, as a principle of morality, that, oh, we have empathy and compassion for the Ukrainian people who are suffering this terrible invasion, and also have empathy and compassion for all the victims of violence, bloodshed, invasion, tyranny, and war the world over. We don't have to pit these groups against each other. And the other problem that I have with this argument is that it comes dangerously close to mirroring right-wing talking points that I heard often and still do hear often with regard to the Gaza conflict, as if protesters, wherever they are in the United States or abroad, they have no right to criticize the Israeli government's war policy in Gaza because where were you guys in Yemen? Why do you guys not condemn the genocide happening in Sudan, and so on and so forth? As if, well, one, as if, like I said before, we can't criticize both, or that the fact that it's happening somewhere else means that we're now all of a sudden barred from criticizing it anywhere we want to particularly point out or want to draw particular attention to. I think despite the clear frustration that author is venting for the fact that we are not paying more attention to these other conflicts, I think when that argument manifests in the way that it was framed there, and he's not the only one framing it like that, it creates a really morally perverse logic, which basically is tantamount to whataboutism, right? You can't complain about anything happening anywhere, unless you raise your voice to whatever you're complaining about happening everywhere, regardless of the broader circumstances of why people are focusing on this conflict in particular, right? Like, let's be perfectly clear. It wasn't the president of Yemen or Saudi Arabia or wherever that Trump decided to invite to the Oval Office and berate and humiliate in front of the entire country and in front of the entire world. The reason why there's this outpouring of support for Ukraine now is because of the broader dynamics of this very particular current story that we were all just witnessing, something that is basically unprecedented in American history. I mean, former American presidents have spoken to their enemies, both domestic and foreign, with more respect than Trump spoke to Zelensky. It's never really something like what Trump and Vance did has never happened in American history. So people are obviously paying a little bit more attention to it. But then a deeper, more troubling argument that I've heard from the left is this idea that the Ukrainians are Nazis. yes, that Ukraine is a white supremacist society. You have this one over here, and someone replying to Raphael Warnock's support of Ukraine in light of that disastrous Oval Office meeting, who accuses Ukraine of being a white supremacist country. Now, there are several problems with this argument. The first being that it's not true, that the Ukrainians being Nazis has been a prominent feature of Russian propaganda against Ukraine since the start of this war. The New York Times actually had this really helpful graph, basically just proving what I just said, how accusations of Ukrainians being Nazis did not exist in any significant or major way until right after February 24th, which is when Russia invaded Ukraine. And then, of course, it started going and going and going. And that doesn't mean that Ukraine doesn't have far-right political parties, even like neo-Nazi parties in its government or in its country. I think we just saw after the German elections, we saw after the French elections this summer, and obviously we saw after our own election here in America in November that, yeah, a lot of advanced democracies are struggling with far-right groups in their own countries. Even far-right paramilitary organizations in their own country. So like you might have seen some of the images of, different Ukrainian battalions, and some of the members will have like the German Iron Cross, or they'll have a swastika or some other, white power symbol or something. And it is true that when the conscriptions into the Ukrainian National Militia happened, a lot of those far-right people were sort of scooped into the national defense of the country. But that's because that's what happens when a country is at war. It's one of the most famous phenomenons in political science, the rally around the flag effect. It's like when a country is invaded by an outsider, all of the different groups within the country, regardless of what their political or ideological differences were before, realize like, hey, at the end of the day, we are all, insert whatever country name it is. And when these people come here with their guns, they don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat or liberal, conservative, whatever it is, neo-Nazi or socialist. They are just seeing us versus them. So when the conscription happens, those people were all grouped together. And yes, those groups have come out now and tried to like distance themselves from like their neo-Nazi roots and everything like that. And it created a lot of really negative photo ops. But that is just the broader context for what was happening. And of course, it should go without saying, but Zelensky himself, being a Jew, is obviously not a Nazi. And Trump himself, despite having a lot of white supremacist ties and beliefs and being surrounded by people with genuinely disturbing views on race and ethnicity, even despite him and his administration, which represent America, being as bad and racist as they are, anyone with a brain knows that that does not make all of America neo-Nazi white supremacists, even if the symbolic representation of our country is. And even if it were, and this is where this argument from the left has a really dangerous parallel on the right, again, in the Gaza situation, right? That is not a justification for a foreign power to come in and bulldoze and ransack and destroy another sovereign country. It's like, even if you guys do hold these terrible ideological or political beliefs, that doesn't mean I want you guys to all die or be invaded by your neighbors or be conquered or be extracted or exploited, because I recognize that as human beings, that's not what you deserve. The argument on the right as related to Gaza is the argument that I heard constantly, is that, oh, well, because Palestinian, particularly Hamas, holds these really regressive views in terms of like women's rights and LGBT, therefore, basically, they and none of the Palestinians are deserving of human rights. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, why should American liberals or progressives care about what is happening to these people because they hold these really terrible views that if they were held by American citizens, they would be canceled over? It's like, okay, even if we concede that, that doesn't mean I want them to all be killed, right? So those are just some of the arguments that I had heard, and I wanted to get all of that off my chest. And now that I have, hopefully I'm not forgetting anything, but I can go start looking at the comments. I know you guys have had a lot to say, and I'll start going through them now. Okay. The U.S. hasn't won a war properly since Korea. And arguably, that was not very, very proper. I mean, we kind of got a compromise outcome in that war. Like, we kept the two Korea split. We really ideally would have wanted to see the collapse of the North Korean regime, but we weren't able to force it militarily, and we got thwarted. So we went for the second best thing that we could get, which was, okay, you guys can stay communist up in the North, but we're going to steamroll through the South. Let's see this one. Claim that God saved him. Yeah. The idea of Trump repenting is a little hilarious to me. We've talked previously on this channel about the comparisons to Trump and the figure of the Antichrist and being the man of lawlessness. Even if he is not the literal Antichrist or the singular man of lawlessness, Trump has the spirit of the Antichrist. And as we know from John, the Antichrist is a type. It is one specific person that is at the end of time, but it is a personality that is repeated in multiple times and places throughout history. Trump doesn't have the ability to repent in his heart. He has totally and fully abandoned, like I said at the beginning of this video, any conception of morality and self-restraint. So, and I know some other people have cited the Revelation 13 verse of, the beast surviving the head wound and all of that, which, who knows, that could actually be true as well. But whatever the reasons were that God had in saving Trump, I don't think it was to assure his repentance, because I don't think Trump is capable of, obviously every human being to some degree is capable of repentance, but I think Trump has made, with every decision he has made in his conscious life on earth, has been in direct rebellion to God and everything that God stands for and is about. That's why when I made my video, which many of you guys saw, about the evangelical idolatry, it's like, idolatry is bad in and of itself, right? Replacing God, like the God you should worship, the God of the universe, with any imperfect human idol is already a problem in and of itself. But taking one that could not be more categorically opposed to every single virtue and moral of Jesus is even more reprehensible. It's like one of the worst things you could do. So sorry, I could talk forever about this, as you can tell. But let's keep going. Yes, Americans, and many Americans are ashamed. And a lot of the broader world is ashamed. And I know, because Trump is a small and petty and insecure man, he probably thinks that he humiliated Zelensky, when in truth, he only humiliated and disgraced himself and the broader country. Already answered the Antichrist question, but I'm sure you guys will keep bringing it up, and at some point I will be forced to make a longer video about it, so stay tuned. Yes, totally agree, but there's also something to be said, which we do not have time to get into now, about how there's, I think, a direct correlation between the cult of celebrity in America and the cult of personality. It lends itself directly to being exploited. If you wanted to politicize that phenomenon, the political equivalent of it is a cult of personality. I already addressed the Nazi things. If you don't agree with my assessment, that's up to you. I explained the context about that. But like I said, even if what you're saying is true, that doesn't make Russia right. You can't just invade countries because you make up things or because you have problems with the ideological adherence or beliefs of that population. So I don't think that's a really good basis for argument. Yeah, I mean, it's even worse than Machiavellianism. I mean, Trump is just practicing the most deranged forms of antisocial narcissism, both domestically and on a global stage. I mean, and in some sense, it relates to the problem America has had throughout its history of, like I said, putting itself first, no matter who pays the cost or what sort of, dastardly devices it has to resort to. But I think Trump is really just like the living embodiment of that. Thank you for this factual citation. Not that $120 billion is nothing. And I think that the $350 billion you get to is like all the different old equipment and Pentagon reserves that America gave to Ukraine out of its own holding. So it wasn't direct financial payments, but it added up to approximately $350 billion. Yes, this goes back to the comment I made about how it's entirely possible for Ukraine to win this war if it gets the support that it needs. Again, we could disagree about whether America should provide that support. I personally have my own reservations and qualms about like, okay, well, are we? And this is the problem that America never really thinks about before it gets into all these foreign quagmires. It's like, okay, even assuming this is a worthwhile political strategic objective to accomplish, are you willing to make the long-term sacrifices? In this case, it's not blood, it's only treasure. But like, let's just say, are you willing to pay what, $50 billion a year for the next 10 to 20 years to really ensure victory? If not, you probably shouldn't get into this sort of fight in the first place. Don't get them started in fighting and resisting and all this stuff and getting them deep in the trenches only to sell them out like halfway through. It's like, do it or don't do it. But this whole like in between thing that we're doing is just not good for anyone. Hey, good to see you too, my brother. Yeah, we're gonna keep the lives going. I just had to do a special episode because there were a couple people in some of my comments and even personal friends of mine that texted me who wanted to hear my opinion on it. So I just wanted to get on here with you guys and start airing it out. Okay, we already talked about the direct financial support points. This also is true. Yeah, I should have also mentioned that with the American self-interest in getting involved in World War II. It's not just that America, especially particularly after the Germans had invaded Russia and that invasion started going very poorly, and then Russia quickly started to steamroll Germany from east to west. It was, and even thinking about the broader European war, it's like America got involved in the last year of a war that had been going on, that ended up going on for 6 years. So yeah, we got in very late, and that's because we weren't necessarily worried that the Nazis wouldn't be defeated. We were worried about who would be left standing and reigning supreme in Europe after they were defeated. So like, okay, well, if the Nazis go down, but then all of Europe is just dominated by the Soviet Union, that's not really what we want. They did not want Western Europe to look like what Eastern Europe looked like after the end of World War II. And of course, it's not an endorsement of the Soviet Union either, right? The living conditions for people in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union were legitimately terrible. But that didn't make America's reasons for opposing them noble. That is a reasonable argument to make. I'm sympathetic to Ukraine's defense, but like I said, I do think there are practical questions we can ask about the wisdom of the long-term support. And then how does this work, right? It's like, let's say in principle that every country or every people whose rights are violated by some bully around the world, that they should be vindicated. How do we determine when and where and to what degree we intervene? I think it raises a whole host of thorny moral questions, which we don't have to fully get into right now, that are separate and apart from the overall morality of the victim's cause in and of itself. So, so not exactly sure how I fall on the actual support. We definitely shouldn't be hauling in the leaders of those countries after giving them said support and trying to humiliate them or gloat in selling them out to their adversaries. That, regardless of what the policy differences are, that I think all people of common sense and goodwill should find morally abhorrent. Yes, Trump wants peace at any cost to get a political win. Zelensky wants peace that will actually last, where Putin won't return to finish the job. Yeah, I think that's largely right, and I think it's even more than that. I think Trump genuinely wants a win for Vladimir Putin, because he knows a win at any cost is really only a win for one person, and would basically validate all of Russia's reasons for going in and invading in the first place, really trying to undo the sort of global consensus that had emerged after World War II that we didn't really want to be the type of global species or a global civilization where invading your neighbors in the most brutal and oppressive ways was going to be a legitimate form of statecraft and foreign policy. So just like how Trump is undoing all sorts of norms in his own country, he's also obviously helping undo them around the world. This is true. That is definitely true. I don't think he's going to make a I don't think he's going to make a Riviera of the Black Sea anytime soon. Okay, good to know. Thank you for the European perspective. I would say, though, you guys know how to take some things across the finish line, like universal healthcare, social services for the majority of our society. Again, not perfect, but still something that we are struggling to do for ourselves. Okay. Half the country lacks empathy. Yes, America has a deep problem with empathy, which explains why we are politically in the situation that we are in right now. It's like, I don't know how to tell you guys that you should care about other people than yourselves, particularly that are suffering and in really tough circumstances. I do not know what this is referring to. I am assuming it's one of the flawed arguments that I was unpacking before. So I will preemptively say I agree with this point. Yeah. A lot of Russian misinformation and talking about anything related to this issue. Like the Nazi thing I thought was just crazy. Particularly to see, I think it was just disappointing for me to see how many people on the left had gotten on board with that. I don't know what it is to be contrarian, or I don't know, maybe it helps boost engagement or visibility with how these algorithms work. But it's like, there are just so many ill-considered ways that people try and support leftist causes that I feel like I have a responsibility to talk about and call out. I agree with the danger of the Christian nationalism. To be fair, if anything, Trump represents a version of a new isolationism in which he wants to withdraw from global affairs. Less so the Wilsonian make the world safe for democracy, whether that's through soft power or just going up and invading countries and bombing people. So it's a little complicated with this particular administration. The Christian nationalism and its dangerous varieties is really much more of a problem for domestic American politics. Going back to Trump's ability to repent, he said he's never asked for forgiveness in his life. He's never said sorry. He's never thought he's done everything wrong. I mean, if the entire point of the faith is that you don't just confess your sins, but you confess that you are nothing without God and you're a hopeless sinner that but for the grace of God is doomed, a person that's suffering from a case of terminal narcissistic personality disorder, that's not going to mesh. Confessing your dependence on another, asking for help, asking for forgiveness, saying you're sorry, recognizing and confessing your flaws, it's not going to work. Thank you. Every country has a Nazi element. There's a better argument to make that the Americans are Nazis, more so than the Ukrainians, if we're just going right by the rhetoric that it tolerates, by the people that it elevates to power, by the structures and operation of its society. There is a way better argument to make that we are the society that has the problem with Nazism over Ukraine. America's never elected a Jewish president. Ukraine currently has one. I could just go on, but that's just such a terrible argument. This is and has been and will continue to be multiple videos on what just about like everything, respect for the Constitution, countering Russia, general foreign policy, judicial restraint at the Supreme Court. Like, where are you going to start yourself? I will look into this more, but again, I don't think it changes the overall argument that I made about, it's not just about, is there a Nazi problem in Ukraine? It's how is the Nazi argument being deployed to make Putin look justified in an act of naked aggression against his neighbor. That is really the problem. It's not like these arguments are being deployed strategically. It's not just people out in search of random information just because they're in some sort of pursuit of truth. That's why I showed the graph from the New York Times about, like, okay, when did people even start caring about this argument? Oh, it's when the Kremlin thought it would be really, really, really convenient to paint the Ukrainians as Nazis so they could sell their invasion as a quote unquote denazification effort. So it's like, you have to think about the broader implications of a lot of these things. And yes, this was the point I was making about the complicity with the Nazis, or how America's conflict with the Nazis was particularly born around self-interest. And not only was white supremacy deeply ingrained in American society, but the Nuremberg laws that the Germans used to basically strip Jewish Germans of civil rights were modeled after the Jim Crow segregation laws in the United States. They used our racist laws as the blueprint for their racist laws. So it's like, yeah, talk about complicity. Okay. I understand the sentiment here. I talked about this on one of my on the live stream from last week, particularly because I, although I'm a progressive, I'm also a Christian, and I do believe that the left has to do a lot of work, and I want to be part of this work of reclaiming the false Christianity for the true Christians who see the problems that are going on in our society and see the ways in which religion is being weaponized to do really bad things. But part of being the quote unquote true Christians is, I think, representing the sort of grace and love and mercy that Jesus had for everyone, but particularly people engaged in sin. And all of us are engaged in it to some degree. So, and this is a really difficult balance for me to strike myself, because as much as I want, because, you need to have that moral aversion to seeing evil and wickedness in the world. It means that you have a functioning moral compass that you can discern and distinguish right from wrong. But we always have to be careful when feeling tempted to give into feelings of hatred or cruelty towards other people. So again, understand the sentiment, and I struggle with it myself, but yeah. Thank you for the explanation, El. And no, MAGA doesn't want to investigate extremism in the DoD, which is, I already made a video about that I just dropped this Saturday about how we're underreacting to Trump, and now he's doing all the military purges, and how that shows how he ultimately plans to hold on to power, etc. And what's particularly disturbing about how the military plays into all of this is how radicalized so many people in the American armed forces have become, like in terms of like right-wing radicalization. And it's like, okay, well, if it really does come between supporting the president and the Constitution, what are these people really going to do? Having considered the relationship between Christian nationalism and basically Russian Christian nationalism. But yeah, it's part of the social conservatism of Putin's Russia is a big thing of what has attracted the MAGA movement, right? Like they kind of like the repressive policies he has towards LGBT, or the things that he says that they consider based. They're like, we're perfectly happy to put up with authoritarianism and dictatorship if it can come disguised in this broader social conservative agenda that we really like. Yes, like I said, you'd be hard pressed to find particularly any Western nation that does not have a Nazi problem, some more than others. I lived and worked for years in Spain. We aren't taught their history to know about their dictator. That's interesting context. I obviously knew about Franco and their problems with the nationalism, but thank you for providing your own personal context. And listen, well, grace and mercy, it's a work in progress. And I think as for those of us who are Christians and identify It's up to us to be the salt and the light before we can expect it or see it in other people. But whew, okay, that was a marathon. Thank you everyone for joining. And as I always do, had to shout out my Patreon patrons who are listed here. Thank you for supporting the channel. It means a ton to me. The more that it's supported by people like you, the more I can keep speaking the truth independently, fearlessly, and honestly. So that comment should be pinned. And y'all know where to find me. All my socials should be in the description of this video. I also have my email on my page. So yeah, reach out, connect, let's stay connected. And I look forward to connecting with all of you guys soon. Thanks so much for joining, and enjoy the rest of your nights and have a lovely week ahead. Truth is signing off.